I always believed that I was the master of my own domain. When I bought my property, I did so with one goal in mind: to live free and independent, away from the clutches of bureaucratic nonsense. But nothing could have prepared me for the day the HOA decided that their ridiculous rules applied to me. Rules I'd never signed up for and would never follow. It all started on a sweltering afternoon when I was minding my own business, working on some repairs on my property, when a flurry of letters began arriving in the mailbox. The notices were filled with absurd demands. You must adhere to community standards. Your property is non-compliant. Failure to obey will result in fines. My blood boiled as I read the harsh, condescending language. Who did they think they were to dictate how I should run my life on my own land? As I scanned the documents, one statement in particular made me stop in my tracks. All residents must conform to the HOA's designated rules or face consequences. I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer idiocy of it all. I've never been part of a cookie-cutter neighborhood, and my property has always been a haven for individuality and freedom. I knew in that moment that I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. Fueled by a mix of anger and defiance, I decided then and there I would not abide by their stupid rules. I would stand tall and prove that they have absolutely no power over me. With my heart pounding and my resolve hardening, I gathered the letters, snapped photos of every absurd demand, and vowed to fight back, not only for myself, but for every independent homeowner who's ever been pushed around by these overzealous bureaucrats. Right then, as I tossed the letters onto my workbench, I declared to myself, I'm done playing by your rules. And so, with a smirk on my face and a fire in my belly, I set off on a journey that would soon bring the HOA's baseless authority crashing down around them. The very next day, as I resumed my daily routine, I began noticing the first signs that the HOA was serious about imposing their ridiculous standards. While I was fixing a loose board on my porch, I found a new notice taped to the door, a formal reminder that my property must conform to their unwritten suburban guidelines. The tone was condescending, as if they expected me to suddenly transform my free-spirited lifestyle into something resembling a cookie-cutter existence. I decided to document everything. I took clear photos of the notice, capturing the aggressive language and the official-looking logos that gave the appearance of legitimacy. I even recorded a short video expressing my disbelief, sarcastically reading aloud, "I must conform. Since when did my property become part of your little community experiment?" I posted that video on my social media channels, and within minutes, comments poured in from fellow property owners, many echoing my sentiment and vowing not to be cowed by these arbitrary rules. Then came the next shock. A week later, I received a visit from two HOA inspectors. They arrived in a beige van that looked far too polished for a routine check on my weathered property. With clipboards in hand, they methodically walked the grounds, stopping at every minor imperfection. An overgrown hedge here, a chipped paint job there, while lecturing me about community aesthetics and the greater good. Their tone was patronizing, and every so often, one would cast a disdainful glance my way, as if to silently ask, "Don't you know better?" I confronted them, my voice steady and laced with sarcasm. "I appreciate your concern, but my property isn't a suburban model home, it's mine exactly as I want it." Their response was a rehearsed spiel about compliance and the need for uniformity. I left the encounter recording in my phone, every word a testament to their absurdity. By this point, it was clear that the HOA wasn't just making idle threats, they were actively trying to change my lifestyle. I began to collect every piece of evidence, every notice, every letter, every recorded conversation. I also reached out to a few neighbors, many of whom had received similar demands. While some were intimidated into silence, a handful were as enraged as I was, sharing stories of their own brushes with the HOA's petty authoritarianism. That day marked the point of no return. I wasn't going to bend to their ludicrous standards. Instead, I resolved to stand firm, document every interaction, and expose the HOA for what it truly was: a group of overreaching bureaucrats with no right to dictate how I live. I spent hours that evening poring over the collected evidence, organizing it meticulously, and drafting a plan of action that would eventually lead to a public showdown. I knew that if I could rally support from other independent homeowners and present our case to the city council, I could force these pencil pushers to back off once and for all. Every minute of that day, every interaction with the HOA's minions, further steeled my resolve. I was not going to let them intimidate me into conformity. I was going to fight back, loudly, boldly, and with every resource at my disposal. And as I closed my eyes that night, I could already envision the day when their stupid rules would be nothing more than a distant, laughable memory. Not long after the initial inspections, the HOA's tactics escalated in ways I could never have anticipated. One morning, I woke up to find that not only had more notices been posted on my property, but someone had also painted a gaudy line along the edge of my yard, a blatant marker of non-compliance with their aesthetic standards. The bright color, so out of place on my rugged property, was a deliberate provocation. I felt a surge of anger as I recorded the bizarre act, knowing full well that it was meant to humiliate and coerce me into submission. That same day, I started receiving a series of threatening text messages. The messages were short and blunt. Follow the rules or face the consequences. One message read, "Don't test our patience, change your property now." Each message was a reminder that the HOA wasn't just sending polite notices, they were resorting to intimidation. I forwarded these messages to my friends and posted them online, and soon, the comments flooded in with support and shared indignation. Later in the afternoon, as I was checking my security footage, I noticed something particularly disturbing. One clip showed a pair of individuals in uniform stealthily approaching my property at dusk. They didn't knock or announce their presence. They simply circled the area and took measurements with a laser device, all while whispering among themselves. The footage was grainy, but it left no doubt in my mind. These were not regular inspectors. They were agents of intimidation, using every tool at their disposal to force me into compliance. Fueled by a mix of indignation and determination, I began organizing a response. I reached out to several fellow homeowners who had expressed similar frustrations. Over late-night conference calls, we compared notes and shared evidence, photos, text messages, and even video clips of our own properties being targeted. It quickly became evident that we were all in the same boat. Our collective anger was mounting, and so was our resolve to fight back. I took to my blog and social media, posting detailed accounts of every outrageous encounter. I posted photos of the painted boundary line, screenshots of the threatening texts, and excerpts of the recorded conversations. My posts were filled with sarcasm and defiance, and they resonated with hundreds of viewers. Comments poured in, with many urging me to take legal action and join forces with others. The online support was overwhelming. It felt like a digital revolution had begun against the HOA's petty tyranny. That evening, I decided to step up my security even further. I installed extra cameras, set up motion detectors around vulnerable areas, and even put up temporary no trespassing signs in bold letters. Each measure was a statement. I was not going to be pushed around. I also began drafting a formal letter to the HOA, detailing every violation, every threat, and every act of intimidation they had committed. This letter would later become a cornerstone of our legal battle. As the day wore on, the escalation continued. I received a phone call from an anonymous number. This time the voice on the other end was colder, more menacing. "You're making a big mistake," the voice warned. "Stop your defiance or you'll regret it." I hung up, my heart pounding, but I refused to be cowed. Each threat only sharpened my resolve. By the end of the day, I was fully entrenched in a battle I knew was bigger than myself. The HOA was clearly determined to force conformity by any means necessary, and I was determined to expose them for the bullies they were. I spent the night compiling my evidence into a comprehensive dossier, ensuring that every piece of proof was documented and time-stamped. I knew that when the time came, I would have everything I needed to show that these stupid rules had no power over me. Just when I thought the HOA's escalating tactics couldn't get any crazier, I uncovered a twist that would redefine the entire battle. It was a rainy afternoon when I received a mysterious email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "The truth behind their rules." My pulse quickened as I opened the email, which contained a series of scanned documents and internal memos that appeared to reveal the true agenda behind the HOA's constant harassment. The documents were damning. They showed that the HOA had been pressured by an influential developer to implement stricter, uniform community standards. Standards designed not to improve our neighborhood, but to drive up property values in select areas and force independent homeowners out. In one memo, an official wrote, "Non-compliant properties must be reined in at all costs. Their removal will streamline our portfolio and boost market prices. Reading these words sent a chill down my spine. The rules weren't about aesthetics or safety at all. They were a power play, a deliberate attempt to force conformity for profit. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I immediately forwarded the documents to my attorney, Dan, who confirmed their authenticity. "This is the smoking gun," he said. "These documents prove that the HOA's rules were never meant to benefit the community. They were meant to serve a hidden financial agenda." The revelation transformed my fight from a personal battle into an exposé of corporate greed and corruption. Determined to expose the truth, I began cross-referencing these memos with public records and meeting minutes from previous HOA board sessions. I discovered that many of the rules they were so adamantly enforcing had been introduced without proper consultation and were based on the developers' demands rather than any community vote. The more I dug, the clearer it became. The HOA was nothing more than a puppet for powerful interests. I recorded a video log that evening, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "They want you to think that their stupid rules are for our benefit," I said to the camera. "But in reality, they're nothing more than a tool to control us and line someone else's pockets." I posted the video online, and within hours, it began to spread. Comments flooded in, outraged homeowners, curious neighbors, and even local journalists expressing interest in the unfolding scandal. The twist didn't end there. I soon received a tip from a fellow homeowner who had attended a closed HOA board meeting. According to his account, a senior board member had openly admitted that the rules were designed to weed out the non-conformists, and that any property not meeting these arbitrarily high standards would eventually be targeted for acquisition. The notion that they planned to force out independent homeowners was both infuriating and galvanizing. Armed with this explosive evidence, I updated my dossier and organized a series of posts on my blog detailing the entire scheme. I broke down the documents, explained the developer's influence, and laid out a timeline showing how the rules had shifted in response to external pressures. Every piece of evidence, every internal memo, and every whispered conversation added to the growing case against the HOA. That night, as I sat in the dim light of my study, I felt a renewed surge of determination. The HOA's power had been built on deception, and now that deception was laid bare. I knew that exposing this truth would not only strengthen my case, but also inspire other independent homeowners to stand up for their rights. The stakes had just gotten higher, and I was ready to take this fight to every level: legal, public, and even political. I saved every document, every email, and every recording, knowing that when the time came, this evidence would be the key to dismantling their entire operation. The truth was on my side, and with it, I was more determined than ever to show that their stupid rules held no power over me or anyone else who refused to be bullied. In the wake of this explosive revelation, my entire approach shifted from mere defiance to a calculated counter-offensive. I realized that if I was going to stand up to the HOA and the powerful interests behind it, I needed to adapt my strategy both legally and personally. Immediately, I began fortifying my evidence archive. Every threatening text, every painted line on my property, every hostile encounter was digitized and meticulously time-stamped. I created a secure cloud-based folder that could not be tampered with, ensuring that the damning internal memos and documents were preserved for court and for public exposure. I also backed up the files on multiple external drives. No way could they erase the truth. On the legal front, I sat down with Dan for a marathon strategy session. We went over every document, every recorded conversation, and every piece of evidence. "This isn't just about defiance anymore," Dan said. "It's about proving that the HOA's actions are not only baseless, but rooted in corruption. We're going to file for an injunction to stop their harassment immediately, and we'll also prepare for a class action lawsuit if necessary." His calm, professional tone gave me a sense of reassurance, and I could feel my resolve hardening with each plan we formulated. At the same time, I knew I had to secure the support of my community. I reached out to other independent homeowners and arranged a series of informal meetings at my property. Over cups of strong coffee on my back porch, we shared our experiences, stories of arbitrary fines, baseless inspections, and the constant barrage of threatening messages. The more we talked, the more it became clear that the HOA's oppressive tactics were widespread. I set up an online forum where we could exchange evidence, share strategies, and rally together. The solidarity among us was empowering. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a collective stand against an overreaching system. I also began a video diary series where I spoke candidly about every new development. In one entry, I explained how the internal memos revealed the true agenda behind the HOA's rules, and I urged viewers to question every community standard that was forced upon them. My videos were raw and unfiltered, laced with sarcasm and unbridled defiance, and they quickly gained traction on social media. Comments and shares flooded in, and soon local media began to take notice. Emotionally, it wasn't easy. I found myself wrestling with anger, grief, and a lingering fear that the HOA might retaliate even more aggressively. There were nights when I lay awake, haunted by the thought of further intimidation, yet every time I recalled the absurdity of their rules and the evidence of their corruption, that fear transformed into a burning desire to fight even harder. I began practicing mindfulness and took long walks through my property, letting the open fields and the whispering wind remind me that I was free to live life on my own terms. I also reworked my public messaging. I updated my website with a clear, concise timeline of events, detailed evidence, and personal reflections on what it meant to stand up against such tyranny. I made sure that every post ended with a call to action. If you're tired of being bullied by arbitrary rules, join our fight. Share your story, demand your rights, and let's take this battle together. The response was overwhelming. People from all over reached out, sharing their own encounters and pledging support. Through all these adaptations, one thing remained crystal clear. I was not going to let the HOA's stupid rules dictate how I lived my life. Every step I took, whether legal, personal, or public, was aimed at dismantling their authority piece by piece. I wasn't just reacting. I was strategizing, adapting, and mobilizing every resource at my disposal. By the end of this period of intense adaptation, I felt more prepared than ever. I had transformed my initial shock and anger into a formidable arsenal of evidence and community support. I was ready to push back harder and show everyone that when you refuse to conform, you're not powerless. You're a force to be reckoned with. Just when I thought I had a handle on the HOA's harassment, new and unexpected challenges began to emerge, complicating the battle further and adding new dimensions to the fight. It started one overcast afternoon when I received a series of anonymous flyers posted around my property. Unlike the official notices, these flyers were crudely printed and handwritten, warning me to comply or suffer the consequences. The message was clear. If I didn't back down, the HOA's reach would extend even further. The flyers weren't just directed at me. They mentioned that all non-conforming properties in the area were under imminent threat of severe penalties. I snapped photos and added them to my growing evidence file, knowing that these crude acts of intimidation would only bolster our case. At the same time, a neighbor of mine, a quiet man named Jeff, approached me with a look of concern. He confessed that he had noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near his property late at night, and that he had seen individuals in dark clothing taking notes near his fence. "I thought it was just my imagination," he said, "but now I'm not so sure." Jeff's story mirrored mine exactly, and his anxiety confirmed that the HOA's tactics were far more pervasive than I had initially suspected. Further complicating matters, I began receiving emails from an unknown sender who claimed to be an ex-HOA board member. The emails detailed internal disagreements and hinted at a rift within the organization. According to the sender, a faction of board members was quietly opposing the harsh measures and wanted to expose the corruption from within. One email read, "We never intended for our rules to be used as weapons, but now they're out of control. If someone speaks up, the truth will come out." This insider's perspective was invaluable. It suggested that not everyone in the HOA was on board with the oppressive policies, and it opened up the possibility of internal allies. Around the same time, a local journalist reached out to me. He had been following my story online and wanted to investigate the broader implications of the HOA's actions. He promised to help shine a light on these practices, potentially sparking a wider movement among independent homeowners. I welcomed the opportunity, knowing that public exposure could force the HOA to reconsider its tactics. Meanwhile, the anonymous flyers and threatening emails intensified. I began receiving voicemails late at night, snippets of menacing warnings that urged me to keep my head down and stop stirring up trouble. The more I compiled, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just operating through official channels, they were also using backdoor methods to intimidate and isolate dissenters. Determined to counter these new challenges, I organized another community meeting at my property. This time, the turnout was even higher. Landowners shared not only their stories of arbitrary fines and hostile inspections, but also tales of mysterious phone calls and strange vehicles lurking in the dark. The collective anxiety was palpable, yet so was the growing sense of solidarity. We agreed that our next step would be to form a united front, sharing evidence, coordinating legal efforts, and even contacting local officials to demand an investigation into these intimidation tactics. I updated my online forum and website with a special section dedicated to these new challenges, encouraging others to upload their own photos, recordings, and stories. The forum quickly became a hub of activity, with heated discussions about whether to take immediate legal action or focus on public awareness. Throughout all this, I continued to document every new piece of evidence meticulously, knowing that every flyer, every email, and every voicemail was a critical piece of the puzzle. By the end of that turbulent week, it was clear that the HOA's campaign was evolving into something far more aggressive and multifaceted than I had ever imagined. The battle was no longer just about my refusal to follow their stupid rules. It was about protecting the rights of every independent homeowner in our community from a regime of intimidation and corruption. In the midst of all these escalating confrontations, I began to feel the personal toll of the battle in ways that I hadn't anticipated. Late at night, when the world outside was quiet, I would sit in my study surrounded by evidence files, security footage, and a wall covered in printed emails, and allow my emotions to catch up with me. The weight of constant threats, relentless harassment, and the knowledge that the HOA was willing to go to any lengths to force compliance started to seep in. One particularly sleepless night, as I reread a particularly venomous voicemail warning me to stop your defiance or face the consequences, I felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. I recalled a time when I believed that my property was a safe haven, a place where I could live on my own terms without interference. Now, every shadow on the wall, every creak in the floorboards, reminded me of the ever-present threat lurking in the background. During this period, I had several intense interactions with other affected homeowners. I spent long evenings on conference calls with Jeff and others who shared their own terrifying experiences. Stories of unexplained knocks at the door in the dead of night, cars that would linger too long near their driveways, and even personal confrontations with intimidating figures claiming to be community enforcers. These calls were cathartic, yet they also filled me with a profound sense of shared vulnerability. We were all in this together, but the constant barrage of stress and fear was beginning to wear us down. I found solace in unexpected places too. One afternoon, while taking a solitary walk through the open fields behind my property, I encountered an old friend who had seen me at my worst. He listened as I vented my frustrations and admitted that sometimes I questioned whether it was all worth it. "Your fight isn't just for you," he reminded me. "It's for everyone who's ever had their freedom trampled by bullies. Don't let them win." His words, simple yet powerful, renewed my determination. Emotionally, I also began to document my inner turmoil in a journal. I wrote about the nights filled with anxiety, the bitter taste of betrayal, and the flickering hope that kept me moving forward. I recorded video diaries in which I spoke candidly about my fears and the personal cost of this battle. These videos were raw and unfiltered, revealing not only my anger but also my vulnerability, something I never thought I'd show. To my surprise, the videos resonated with viewers online, and the flood of supportive comments helped ease the isolation I had been feeling. At the same time, I struggled with the constant challenge of balancing the fight against the HOA with maintaining a semblance of normalcy. My daily routines, tending to my property, checking on the security system, or even enjoying a quiet cup of coffee, became interspersed with moments of hypervigilance. Every unexpected sound or shadow sent my heart racing, a reminder that the threat was never truly gone. These emotional interactions and personal dilemmas were as critical to my journey as the legal and public battles. They reminded me that behind every piece of evidence and every recorded threat was a human being fighting to reclaim a piece of their soul. And while the constant stress was draining, it also forged a deep, unbreakable resolve within me. In one particularly moving moment, I hosted a small gathering at my property with several neighbors. As we sat around a makeshift fire pit, sharing stories of both triumph and despair, I realized that our collective pain was slowly transforming into collective strength. We spoke of loss, of the anger that burned within us, and of the hope that one day our freedom would be restored. It was a bittersweet reminder that while the battle was arduous, it was also uniting us in ways that transcended the immediate conflict. Every day, I continued to document my journey, recording interactions, logging every detail, and reaffirming my commitment to fight. And though the emotional toll was heavy, it fueled my determination to expose the HOA for what it truly was, an overreaching institution that had no power over me or over anyone who refused to be silenced. Just when I thought the emotional strain and mounting evidence couldn't push the conflict any further, a series of new and shocking developments emerged that escalated the tension to unprecedented heights. One chilly evening, as I was finalizing my daily evidence log, I noticed that my front door had been tampered with. The lock appeared to have been subtly picked, and I found faint scratches on the doorframe, an unmistakable sign of forced entry. My heart raced as I reviewed the security footage from that night. In the grainy video, I saw a shadowy figure near the door, their hand lingering over the lock before disappearing into the darkness. This wasn't the first time I'd encountered such an incident, but it was the most blatant yet. A direct challenge to my safety. The following day, I received a package at my doorstep containing a single sheet of paper. In bold, angry handwriting, it read, "Obey the rules or suffer the consequences." The note wasn't signed, and there was no return address, just a chilling warning that left me unsettled. I immediately photographed the note and added it to my digital archive, knowing that every threat would count in the long fight. That same afternoon, while reviewing a series of recent texts from an unknown number, I discovered something even more alarming. The messages weren't just vague threats. They contained specific instructions. Change your property's appearance by tomorrow, or we will escalate. The text referenced details unique to my property, confirming that whoever was behind these messages had been monitoring my every move. I felt exposed and violated, as if my every action was under surveillance. As if that weren't enough, my online forum began buzzing with reports from other homeowners. One neighbor recounted a disturbing encounter where a group of individuals in dark clothing had been seen measuring his property with laser devices under the cover of darkness. Another user posted a blurry photo of a vehicle with tinted windows parked near their home late at night. The growing number of similar reports painted a picture of a coordinated intimidation campaign, one that extended far beyond my own property. In the midst of these escalating threats, I received a phone call from an unknown number in the dead of night. The voice on the other end was low and menacing, saying, "You think you're untouchable. Follow our rules or you'll pay dearly." The call lasted only a few seconds, but the fear it instilled was profound. I immediately recorded the call and forwarded it to my attorney. Every new piece of evidence, the tampered lock, the threatening package, the detailed text messages, and the anonymous phone call, added another layer to the already intricate web of harassment. It was clear that the HOA, or someone acting on its behalf, was willing to use every trick in the book to force compliance. The escalation was no longer limited to bureaucratic nonsense. It had become a full-blown campaign of intimidation designed to break my spirit. Determined not to be cowed, I stepped up my countermeasures. I installed additional outdoor cameras with infrared capability, upgraded my alarm system, and even placed motion-activated lights around vulnerable areas of my property. I informed local law enforcement of the incidents and requested increased patrols around my home. Every precaution was a defiant act, proof that I refused to be a victim. Despite the fear and the relentless pressure, I began to see a silver lining in the community response. My online forum exploded with solidarity. Neighbors shared their own unsettling experiences, and many vowed to document every odd occurrence. The collective spirit was powerful, a shared determination that if we all stood together, the HOA's intimidation campaign would be exposed and stopped. That night, as I sat by my computer reviewing the latest images and messages, I felt a mix of adrenaline, fear, and unyielding resolve. The stakes had never been higher, and every new threat only sharpened my determination to show that their stupid rules held no power over me. The HOA's tactics had escalated into personal territory, but I was ready for whatever came next. As the wave of new threats continued to crash over my daily life, I began connecting the dots between every incident and piece of evidence. It was no longer a series of isolated acts of intimidation. The HOA's campaign had become a carefully orchestrated assault aimed at silencing independent homeowners like me. Late one night, while reviewing my extensive evidence archive, I noticed a pattern emerging from the threatening texts and anonymous emails. Several messages mentioned a final compliance check, scheduled for the end of the month, a date that hadn't been disclosed through any official channel. Cross-referencing this with other homeowners' reports on my online forum, I realized that this final check was a coordinated effort to force those of us who refused to play by their rules into making drastic changes. Digging deeper, I revisited the internal documents I had uncovered during previous investigations. Among them, I found a memo with the subject line Phase 2 Mandatory Conformity. The memo outlined a plan to systematically target non-compliant properties through a series of escalating measures, including public shaming, increased fines, and even the use of private security forces. The language was clinical, as if discussing routine maintenance, yet the implications were terrifying. This was a premeditated strategy to force us all into submission. I reached out to a couple of contacts within the community who had managed to secure confidential copies of HOA meeting minutes. Their revelations were damning. In one excerpt, a board member was heard saying, "If they don't change, geez, we'll have no choice but to make an example out of them." Another minute detailed a discussion about hiring a specialized security firm to monitor and enforce compliance on a 24/7 basis. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the HOA was not just overzealous. They were colluding with external forces to enforce a draconian agenda. I also connected with an ex-HOA board member who had grown disillusioned with the organization. In a recorded conversation, he admitted that many of the rules were introduced not for the benefit of the community, but to increase property values in select, lucrative areas. "It's all about profit," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "They want to weed out anyone who doesn't fit the mold so they can flip the properties for a tidy sum." His words resonated with every piece of evidence I had amassed. Armed with these revelations, I updated my digital archive and created a detailed timeline on my website, mapping out every incident, from the first absurd notice to the latest nighttime intrusion, and linking them to the internal memos and meeting minutes. The timeline was a damning, showing how every act of intimidation was a deliberate step in the HOA's plan to force conformity. I published a lengthy blog post detailing my findings, complete with screenshots of the memos, transcriptions of recorded conversations, and a breakdown of the final compliance check plan. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from outraged homeowners, and local journalists began reaching out for interviews. The community was waking up to the fact that this wasn't just about enforcing arbitrary rules. It was about a systematic abuse of power designed to strip away our freedom. That night, as I sat in the glow of my computer screen reading supportive messages and watching the timeline gain traction online, I felt a renewed surge of determination. The revelations were irrefutable. The HOA was orchestrating a campaign of fear, and their actions were driven by profit and control rather than any genuine concern for community welfare. Every connection I made, every document I linked together, strengthened my resolve. So I was not just fighting for my right to live as I wished. I was fighting to expose a corrupt system that threatened the very fabric of our independent community. I knew that the next step would be to take this explosive evidence to the authorities and the public, ensuring that the full truth could not be hidden any longer. The mounting evidence and relentless pressure finally forced a public confrontation that would decide the course of our struggle. One brisk morning, I received word that a coalition of independent homeowners had organized an emergency town hall meeting to demand action from local officials. The stakes were clear. If we could force the authorities to recognize the HOA's abusive tactics, our fight would take on an official, legal dimension. I arrived at the community center, evidence binder and digital dossier in hand, to find a packed room filled with angry, determined faces. The atmosphere was electric. Each person there had their own story of harassment and defiance, and together, we were a force to be reckoned with. The meeting began with the council chair outlining the serious nature of our complaints. "We have received numerous reports of intimidation and illegal actions by the HOA," he stated gravely. As he spoke, I could see that even the local officials were beginning to take notice of the mounting evidence. Then, I took the stage. With my voice steady and full of conviction, I recounted my own ordeal, the absurd notices, the threatening texts, the nighttime intrusions, and, most damning of all, the internal documents revealing the HOA's true agenda. I laid out the timeline on a large screen, each slide a testament to our collective struggle. "This isn't about minor infractions," I declared. "This is about an institution abusing its power to force conformity and line its own pockets at the expense of our freedom." The room fell silent as I presented the final piece of evidence, the memo outlining Phase 2, mandatory conformity. The impact was immediate. Gasps and murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. The local council member, his face stern with resolve, asked for clarification on the authenticity of the documents. My attorney, Dan, stood up and methodically verified every piece of evidence. His confirmation silenced any lingering doubts. At that moment, a representative of the HOA was unexpectedly summoned to the meeting. His arrival, marked by a palpable air of defensiveness, only further fueled the crowd's ire. When asked to explain the illegal enforcement actions and the mysterious final compliance check, he stuttered incoherently. We believe these measures were necessary for the greater good," he mumbled, only to be cut off by a chorus of boos and shouts from the assembled homeowners. Emboldened by the crowd's support, I pressed on, "The greater good? You call this an effort to standardize a community? I call it a sham, a calculated move to force us into submission and profit from our resistance. My refusal to follow your stupid rules is not only my right, it's a stand against every attempt to dictate how I live my life." My words echoed through the hall as the tension reached its breaking point. The council chair finally spoke. "Based on the overwhelming evidence and testimonies, we will initiate an independent investigation into these practices, effective immediately. Any further enforcement actions against independent properties will be halted." The declaration was met with thunderous applause and cheers, a public repudiation of the HOA's tactics. In that critical moment, as the HOA representative was escorted out in disgrace, I felt the culmination of every ounce of struggle. We had taken our grievances to the highest level and forced a change. The confrontation was the turning point, and it was clear that the power of the community, united and vocal, was stronger than any set of stupid rules imposed by a faceless organization. As the meeting concluded, I left with a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but we had forced the authorities to acknowledge our plight. The HOA's abuse of power had been laid bare, and justice was on the horizon. That day, our collective voice proved that no one, no matter how high their authority, could bully independent homeowners into submission. Following the explosive town hall meeting, the battle entered its final phase, a direct confrontation with the HOA's representatives, where every demand would be laid on the table and every right defended. Later that same day, I arranged a meeting on my property with a small delegation of affected homeowners and a few local officials who had promised to monitor the HOA's actions. We gathered in the backyard, a place that symbolized our independence and defiance, and waited as dusk turned the sky a fierce orange. Before long, the HOA's enforcers arrived. They came in a nondescript van, their expressions unreadable but their intent unmistakable. The lead inspector stepped forward with a clipboard, his tone formal yet strained. "We are here to discuss your non-compliance with community standards and to propose corrective measures," he announced, clearly expecting me to capitulate. I stood up, my voice cutting through the cool evening air. "I'm here to tell you that I refuse to be bullied by your stupid rules. My property is not subject to your arbitrary standards, and I demand that you cease all harassment immediately." The words were delivered with a mix of controlled fury and unwavering determination. A tense silence fell. One of the HOA representatives attempted to interject. "Sir, perhaps we can work out a settlement." But I cut him off sharply. "A settlement? You want me to pay you off and forget that you illegally tried to control my life?" My challenge left no room for compromise. I laid out a list of my demands, a full retraction of every baseless notice, a public apology for the intimidation, and an immediate end to any further inspections or enforcement actions on my property. The inspector's face turned red, and he hesitated. I pressed on. "You have no power over me. I have evidence, I have support, and I have the law on my side. If you continue these tactics, Know that I'm fully prepared to take you to court and expose every bit of your corruption." His colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time, I sensed that my words were having an impact. A local official present at the meeting, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward and said, "We have been closely monitoring these developments, and I assure you that any further harassment will be met with decisive legal action." The official's statement was a turning point, an affirmation that our cause was not only just, but was also backed by the local government. After a few agonizing minutes of back and forth, the HOA representatives finally conceded that they would review my demands with their board and provide a formal response within 48 hours. "This is our final offer," the inspector said, his voice strained. I replied, "Then consider this my final refusal to abide by your stupid rules." My words resonated with the assembled homeowners, many of whom nodded in solidarity. As the representatives departed, I felt the weight of the confrontation lift slightly, but I also knew that the next 48 hours would be crucial. I gathered with my neighbors on the porch, discussing what the HOA's response might mean and preparing for every eventuality. Every detail, every exchanged look, reaffirmed that we were united in this fight. That night, I updated my online forum with a detailed account of the confrontation, urging everyone to stay vigilant and to document any further missteps. I knew that when the HOA's response came, it would either mark the beginning of our final victory or force us into the courtroom for a battle we were more than ready to wage. The waiting period was agonizing. Every minute felt like an eternity as I anxiously awaited the HOA's response. On the morning of the 48-hour deadline, my phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls from concerned neighbors and legal advisors. I had arranged to meet Dan at a local cafe to review the response as soon as it arrived. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. This was the moment when everything would come to a head. At precisely 10 a.m., an email notification popped up on my phone. I opened it to find the HOA's formal response. An apology was nowhere to be found. Instead, the email was filled with vague assurances that further investigations would be conducted and that non-compliance issues would be resolved in due course. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a slap in the face, a feeble attempt to placate us while avoiding any real accountability. I immediately forwarded the email to Dan, who reviewed it with a grim expression. "This isn't acceptable," he told me. "They're trying to stonewall us with empty promises. It's time to take this to court." I felt a surge of vindication. Finally, they were forcing our hand. That afternoon, I organized a press conference at my property. I wanted the world to see what we were up against. With my evidence binder in hand, I stood in front of a backdrop of my property, a property that had been under siege by these bureaucratic bullies, and recounted my entire ordeal. I played clips from the threatening texts, showed photos of the unauthorized notices, and even read excerpts from the internal memos that revealed the HOA's true motives. The gathered crowd, including local reporters and community members, was visibly moved by the sheer audacity of the HOA's actions. As I concluded the press conference, I declared, "Today, I'm taking this fight to court. I will not rest until every one of these unjust actions is punished, and until I reclaim the freedom to live my life on my own terms." The applause that followed was thunderous, a powerful affirmation that we had the support of our community and that the tide was finally turning. Later that evening, I stepped into the courtroom, my heart pounding in anticipation of the legal battle ahead. With Dan by my side and my meticulously organized dossier in hand, I felt ready to face the full force of the HOA's legal machinations. The courtroom was packed with spectators, neighbors, journalists, and even a few skeptical officials, and every eye was on me as I took the stand. The proceedings were intense. I presented every piece of evidence, from the threatening emails to the internal HOA memos, methodically building the case that their rules were not only baseless, but were imposed through intimidation and corruption. The opposing counsel tried to argue that the HOA was simply enforcing community standards, but every argument was swiftly dismantled by the clarity and volume of my evidence. As the judge leaned forward, clearly impressed by the strength of the case, I could feel the culmination of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, and every act of defiance. The judge's words finally rang out. The evidence presented unequivocally shows that the HOA's actions were unauthorized and constitute an abuse of power. This court orders an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against the plaintiff's property. and a full investigation into the practices of the HOA is hereby mandated. In that moment, as the courtroom erupted in applause, I felt the final blow, the crushing defeat of a corrupt system. The power of the HOA, built on intimidation and unfounded rules, had been shattered by the force of truth and community solidarity. Walking out of the courtroom later that day, I was overcome with a mixture of relief, triumph, and a deep sense of justice. The battle had reached its peak, and the final blow had been delivered. I had shown that no one, no matter how loud or forceful, could dictate how I lived my life. I had reclaimed my power, and more importantly, I had set an example for every independent homeowner facing similar oppression. The tension that had been building for weeks exploded on a night when everything came to a head. I had been tracking every threat, every outrageous notice, and every instance of harassment, and now, armed with an insurmountable dossier, I was ready for the ultimate showdown. I had arranged for a press conference at my property, the same land that had been my refuge, and now the battleground for my independence. That night, under a sky heavy with dark, swirling clouds and a gusty wind that whipped the fields, I stood on the front lawn with my evidence binder clutched in one hand and a portable projector set up to display my documentation on a makeshift screen hung between two trees. Reporters, local activists, and dozens of independent homeowners gathered, their faces a mix of anticipation and resolve. As the crowd settled into a heavy silence, I began by recounting every instance of intimidation, the absurd notices demanding conformity, the threatening text messages, the unauthorized inspections, and, most damning of all, the internal documents that revealed the HOA's true agenda. I pressed play on a video that showed a grainy clip of inspectors measuring my property with a laser device, all while whispering hostile warnings. The footage elicited gasps and murmurs from the audience. I then displayed copies of the threatening flyers and screenshots of the anonymous texts. With every slide, I built an undeniable case. The HOA's actions were nothing more than a coordinated assault on our freedoms. I paused for effect as the wind rustled the trees, and then I revealed the final bombshell, an internal memo titled Phase 2, Mandatory Conformity. I explained in no uncertain terms that this document outlined a deliberate plan to force independent homeowners into compliance by imposing draconian measures and even involving private security forces. This, I said, my voice rising, is the smoking gun that exposes their greed and corruption. They want you to think their stupid rules are for the greater good, but in reality, they are nothing more than a tool for control and profit. The tension in the crowd was palpable. I could see that many were clenching their fists, nodding in agreement. At that moment, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. A group of local law enforcement officers had arrived, responding to a tip I had provided about the ongoing harassment. Their presence added a layer of official legitimacy to our gathering. The city council chair then took the stage, his voice steady. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented here tonight, we can no longer ignore the abuse of power by the HOA. Their actions violate not only community guidelines, but basic property rights. Effective immediately, we are ordering an independent investigation into these practices. Applause erupted from the assembled crowd, and I felt a surge of vindication rush through me. But the climax wasn't just about official declarations. It was also about personal triumph. As I looked out over the sea of determined faces, I recalled every sleepless night, every threat that made my heart race, every moment of doubt. I thought of my property, my sanctuary, and all the independent homeowners who had been bullied into silence. This is our moment, I declared, my voice echoing in the cool night air. A moment where we say no one, no bureaucrat, no developer, no corrupt HOA has any power over us. At that moment, an unexpected cheer went up from the crowd as several local reporters began live streaming the event. My words were now reaching far beyond our small community. Every viewer online saw the evidence, heard the testimonies, and felt the undeniable truth. The HOA's campaign of intimidation had been exposed for what it truly was. The final blow had been delivered. I closed my presentation by saying, "Tonight we reclaim our freedom. Tonight we show that the power of truth and community can shatter even the most oppressive systems. I demand that the HOA immediately retracts all their baseless notices, halts any further harassment, and issues a public apology for the shameful actions they've committed." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the collective anticipation of what was to come. As the meeting drew to a close, the City Council Chair reiterated their commitment to pursue every legal avenue against the HOA. The officers assured us that they would begin a formal inquiry, and local activists promised to keep the pressure on until real change was enforced. Standing there under the stormy sky, I felt an overwhelming mix of relief, triumph, and determination. The final confrontation had not only shattered the HOA's facade, but had also united our community in a way that no one could have predicted. In that electrifying moment, as thunder rumbled in the distance and cheers filled the air, I knew that our fight had reached its ultimate climax, a moment where justice finally began to prevail. And I, along with every independent homeowner here, had taken our first definitive step toward reclaiming our rightful power. In the wake of that explosive night, life slowly began to return to a new kind of normal, a normal that was defined not by fear and conformity, but by resilience, community, and the unwavering belief in our own independence. The ruling from the City Council and the public exposure of the HOA's corrupt practices rippled through our community, igniting a spirit of empowerment among independent homeowners everywhere. I returned to my property with a profound sense of relief and renewed purpose. The house, once threatened by the arbitrary whims of a faceless organization, now stood as a proud symbol of our victory. Every repaired wall and freshly tended garden was a testament to the fact that our rights could not be so easily trampled. I took long walks through the fields, breathing in the crisp air, each step a reminder of how far we had come. The memories of that fateful night, the surging cheers, the flashing cameras, the determined faces of my neighbors, remained with me, fueling a quiet joy and a deep, abiding satisfaction. In the days that followed, our small community of independent homeowners became more than just a group of individuals fighting a battle. We became a movement. Meetings were organized on porches and in local halls, where we shared our experiences and planned further steps to safeguard our rights. Our online forum exploded with messages of support, stories of past injustices, and an outpouring of solidarity that stretched far beyond our borders. It was clear that our struggle was resonating with others who had faced similar challenges. Local media outlets picked up our story, broadcasting our victory as a landmark moment in the fight against bureaucratic tyranny. I was invited to speak at community events and on local radio, where I recounted the journey from the first ridiculous HOA notice to the triumphant public showdown. In every interview, I made sure to emphasize that this victory wasn't just mine. It was a win for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by arbitrary rules. Our voices had been raised, and the message was clear. No one has the power to dictate how we live our lives. I continued to document my journey on my website, updating it with photos of the press conference, the evidence that had been presented, and detailed accounts of every step of the legal process. I encouraged others to stand up, to share their stories, and to hold authorities accountable. Our freedom is non-negotiable, I wrote in one of my final blog posts, and together we can create a community where every individual is respected and every home is truly our own. Every evening, as I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee, I reflected on the transformation that had taken place, not just in the battle against the HOA, but within myself. I had grown stronger, more resilient, and more connected to a community that believed in the power of truth. The memories of the past, of angry phone calls, threatening letters, and sleepless nights, had given way to a future filled with hope and possibility. My mother's legacy, which had once been imperiled by corporate greed, was now celebrated as a beacon of resistance and independence. In our community, the victory served as a turning point. Other homeowners began to organize, forming coalitions to monitor and report any further attempts at intimidation. Our collective vigilance became a powerful deterrent against future abuses. The local government, now fully aware of the extent of the corruption, pledged to keep a close watch on HOA practices, ensuring that no independent homeowner would ever be bullied into submission again. As I looked to the future, I knew that challenges might still arise. Bureaucratic inertia and the lure of profit were powerful forces, but our united stand had shown that when truth and community come together, even the most oppressive systems can be dismantled. I made a personal vow to continue this fight, not just for my own sake, but for every person who cherishes their right to live freely and authentically. Before I sign off, I want to extend a heartfelt message to every viewer. If you've ever felt cornered by arbitrary rules or overwhelmed by bureaucratic power, know that you are not alone. Share your story, stand up for your rights, and join the movement of independent homeowners who refuse to let anyone dictate how you live your life. Your voice matters, and together we can keep the flame of freedom burning bright. Thank you for following my journey. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, share it widely, and leave your comments below. Let's make sure that our voices and our homes remain free from tyranny. Remember, they have no power over you. Your spirit is invincible. Stay strong, stay independent, and I'll see you in the next video.